This river looked very different in the late 1800s. This bridge did not exist and would not be built for another 100 years. Saginaw and Bay City were experiencing a green gold rush. Men were making fortunes in lumber and industrial salt. Large and small lumber mills lined both banks of the river. At one time there were about 8 mills in this short stretch of river from here to the next bridge. In fact, in the 1870s, there were more than 100 lumber mills running flat out, 24/7 between here and Saginaw Bay. This section of the east shoreline was home to the Rust Brothers and Company lumber yard. Ezra Rust was well known in the lumber and salt business. He became a very successful and wealthy lumber baron in the late 1800s. He donated Rust Park to the city of Saginaw. Ezra Rust Drive is named after him, and Rust Avenue also bears the family name. All the lumber mills on the banks of the river were fed by logs that were floated down from the abundant virgin white pine forests upstream and surrounding the tributary rivers feeding into the Saginaw River. The logging of these forests was primarily done in the winter months when the ground and river were frozen solid. This allowed the logs to be more easily transported by horse-drawn sleds. The logs were piled on the riverbanks or stacked on the ice of the frozen rivers, where they patiently waited for spring thaws. When the ice melted, they would become waterborne and float down the river as a slowly moving mass of wood, sometimes spanning from shore to shore and miles long. Many mills also had salt production operations to bring in extra money. To make salt, they pumped naturally occurring salt brine from underground deposits, collected it in vats, and then boiled off the water in evaporators. The thermal energy for concentrating the brine came from the waste steam generated by steam-powered equipment in the sawmills, including steam engines. Steam engines powered the saws and planers. The west shoreline here was home to the huge Bliss and Van Auken Lumber, Planing, and Salt Block Company. This sprawling operation took up a full half-mile of the west shoreline. Lumber milling in the late 1800s was a competitive, cutthroat business. New mills, joint ventures, and new companies were constantly being formed, while existing mills were bought out, forced out of business, or caught fire, only to be promptly rebuilt and restarted under new ownership. Accidental fires were very common, causing the destruction of many sawmills, shingle mills, and salt block plants. In 1878 alone, 5 mills burned down. Also not uncommon were injuries and deaths related to lumbering. Logging and river operations claimed many lives. While in the mills, men had their hands shredded and arms severed by circular saws, limbs broken by shifting lumber, or bodies crushed by huge logs. In spite of the dangers, the mills paid well and continued to employ thousands of workers. The highest lumber production year was 1882. The Court Street Bridge was originally a swing bridge built in 1898. Looking toward this west shore in 1888, you wouldn't even see the shoreline because freshly cut lumber was stacked so high on the wharf. This photo was of the impressive A.W. Wright lumber docks on the west shore. The logs in the foreground are floating on a glassy smooth Saginaw River queued up for processing in the mill. This photo is of the Holland Street lumber docks, with boards stacked high and a ship ready to be loaded for its voyage out to Saginaw Bay and onto the vast inland seas known as the Great Lakes. The Pierre Marquette Railroad was incorporated in 1899. It was merged into the C&O Railroad in 1947, and then the C&O was merged into CSX Transportation in 1987. By the way, the train in the movie The Polar Express was modeled after the steam locomotive Pierre Marquette 1225. The limestone Michigan Bell Building, better known as the AT&T Building today, was built in the early 1930s and added onto in 1974. Next to it, you'll see a beautiful castellated red brick building, which was originally built to house National Guard and Naval Brigade personnel. Known as the Saginaw Armory, it was designed by architect William T. Cooper and built in 1909. This building is now used as office space for those lucky enough to work in such an impressive building with a view of the river out its windows on the west side. This is a 1912 panorama photo looking east toward downtown Saginaw. You'll notice the Armory building on the far right. This is the Genesee Street Bridge, and to the left is the Lee and Katie building. Lee and Katie was a wholesale grocery company. This building still stands, known today as the Morley Building. Here on the west shore, just south of the Genesee Avenue Bridge, was another big operation, the C.K. Eddy & Sons Lumber and Salt Block Company. Saginaw used to be two separate cities, Saginaw City on the west side of the river and East Saginaw on the east side. The two were consolidated in 1889. If you were to land your boat by this bridge and walk the tracks east 1/4 mile, you would come to the old Potter Street Rail Station. This ornate brick masterpiece was built in 1881 and was a thriving, luxurious hub enjoyed by rail travelers for the next several decades. But with the advent of the automobile and improved roads, passenger rail service started a slow decline. The station continued passenger service until 1950. In the years following, CSX Transportation used the station to house railroad employees and then finally closed it for good in 1986. The station is now owned by the Saginaw Depot Preservation Society, which has done some limited upkeep to help slow the rate of decay. But as with any large building that outlives its usefulness, this once beautiful building is slowly falling apart. To restore this station to its former glamour would cost millions of dollars. Perhaps it's better just to imagine it as it once was. Like the California gold rush, some risked all and lost everything in their quest for riches in the green gold rush, while others made small fortunes, and a few started from nothing and made millions. One notable example was Wellington R. Burt, who started at age 26 working in a lumber mill on the Pine River. After a month, he was promoted to foreman, and with his increase in pay, combined with money saved from previous jobs, he bought 300 acres of forest land in Gratiot County and started his own lumber company in 1858. In 1864, now in his mid-30s, he built a lumber mill along the Saginaw River, as well as a mill community, which he named Melbourne, which, in the span of 3 years, became one of the largest mills in the world. The mill town of Melbourne included shops, boarding houses, a library, and a schoolhouse. Tragically, in 1876, Burt's success took a turn when his mill and most of Melbourne was destroyed by fire. In spite of this terrible loss, he was far from going bankrupt, as he had other lucrative investments, including forest land in Minnesota that was sitting on a valuable iron mine. He also had investments in the salt industry, foreign bonds, banking investments, and railroads. At one time, he owned most of the Ann Arbor Railroad system and had purchased railroads in China and Russia. He even had plans to build a sugar beet factory in Owasso, but never broke ground on that venture. His interests being diverse, he owned a paddle boat, and in the late 1800s, a ride on the paddle steamer Wellington R. Burt was a popular sightseeing adventure on the Saginaw River. In his political career, Mr. Burt served 2 years as mayor of East Saginaw and was elected to the Michigan State Senate for 2 years. Later in life, he lived in a beautiful 3-story brick mansion in Saginaw located at Cherry Street and East Genesee Avenue, which has since been demolished. Wellington Burt died in 1919 at age 87. At the time of his death, Wellington R. Burt was ranked as the 8th wealthiest man in America, with assets equal to $1.5 billion in today's dollars. Because of internal strife in his family, Wellington Burt structured his will in such a way that would exclude his children and grandchildren from receiving any inheritance after his death. However, Mr. Burt gave generously to organizations in the Saginaw area, including funding the city auditorium, the Burt Manual Training School, a women's hospital, a Salvation Army, and a YWCA. The town of Burt, Michigan is named for him, as is Burt Street in Saginaw. The Burt Opera House in Taymouth Township carries his name, and the building is still in use today, repurposed as a community center. Wellington R. Burt was inducted into the Saginaw Hall of Fame in 1967. The lumber boom of the 1800s brought great wealth and economic prosperity to the Saginaw and Bay City area. A downside of this boom was the clear-cutting of almost all the magnificent virgin forests in the area. These forests surrendered all their trees to the insatiable demand for lumber needed for construction in our growing nation. Although these virgin forests are long gone, you can still catch a glimpse of how they used to look at Hartwick Pines State Park, a 49-acre preserve which was not logged and where the tall trees still stand. There you will see trees unlike any other forest in Michigan, big, tall trees like the entrepreneurs of the 1800s saw when they settled here to make their fortunes.